Hey guys, welcome back to class. I hope you had a restful weekend, and if you were out protesting, good for you, and I hope that you were able um, to rest as well and recharge, and that you were safe while doing so. So we're jumping into the topic for our overall semester, which is implicit or unconscious bias. And so we're starting blind spot today, which is called the hidden biases of good people. And hopefully between now and Wednesday, you're able to read that first chapter, engage in a couple of the reading activities we're going to be doing every beginning of the week, which I'm going to talk about at the very end of this quick little intro. And so the stuff that I'm going to talk about is already defined in the text, but I wanted to make sure that I went over just some of the basic terms and ideas before you engage in the text. So let's start with this scenario. We look at somebody and we categorize or we classify them, or we classify any object that we see. So for example, we see a person walking towards us and our brains say, oh, male, Asian, middle-aged. Three of the most obvious things we can notice about somebody: their race, their age, their gender representation. Is this bad? No. It seems kind of iffy to us because we can see how this can connect to stereotyping, but just observing what people's race is not, or people's age or people's gender is not stereotyping. This is just a basic thing that our brain does, and we need to do it. But it doesn't just stop there. Like, we need to now access all of the information we have about these different, let's say, hashtags that will help us know how to maneuver in this situation. And so often, people will look at, for example, our nameless dude, and if they see Asian, they'll reach into that folder where they keep all of the things they know about people who are Asian, men who are Asian. And the most common things that come up, let's say, like food, Asian food, maybe like kung fu or karate. That's a very stereotypical thing that's connected with Asian culture, or the stereotype of like, oh, good at math and sciences, or plays a lot of instruments. We see those represented in the lack of variety of Asian and Asian American actors on television, or in the mainstream media. And for somebody who perhaps doesn't live in a community that has a lot of Asian or Asian American families, or who does not know very many people personally who are Asian or Asian American, they may just have these things to rely on. That's not great. Their folder that they keep all of the information that they tuck into is pretty small. Maybe they have a larger folder about something else. Maybe they have a larger folder about I don't know, Russian Americans or Russians, because they have a large Russian community in their town, or maybe they go to a Russian Orthodox church, and so that's a lot fatter. Maybe they won't rely on some basic stereotypes for Russian people because they just have more of a variety to choose from. They've learned more about that. And so these folders that we keep in our head are called schemas. They're these mental categories where whenever we learn something new, we tuck that new piece of information into one of those folders. And as I said, some folders are bigger than others. I think because most of us live in Irvine or in greater Orange County, we have a pretty, well represented Asian and Asian American community. And so a lot of us have a larger folder than that. We may not just rely on those 5 things, but we probably have some schemas that are a lot thinner. And of course, the schema that fits our identity, so whether it's female, whether it's, bisexual, whether it's trans, whether it's Muslim, whether it's younger or educated or whatever, is going to be a little bit fatter than a schema that we don't know as much about. And these schemas are not bad. Actually, they're great. If we didn't have these schemas, our life would be utterly exhausting. So we have schemas for everything, even something like a chair. The first time that we saw somebody sit on a chair, we created a new file folder called chair. And then we learned how to sit on the chair. And then that was tucked into that file folder. And then we learned more about the different varieties of chair, so that now in our adulthood, we don't have to pause when we look at a chair and say, okay, what is that thing? It has 4 legs. Oh, but maybe not 4 legs, because look, this one has wheels. It has a seat thing. It has a backrest. Okay, I think that is a chair for me to sit on. And now let me see how I can navigate putting my butt on that thing. Like, no, and thank God, that would be so exhausting if we had to relearn what a chair was every time we wanted to sit down. We can see that even though this chair on the left doesn't have padding, that it's also a chair. These are both chairs. And this one doesn't have legs, just has wheels, but we can still see that it's a chair because our schema is pretty big on that. We've collected a lot of chair knowledge. It's the same thing with doors. We don't have to pause every time we walk through a door. Most of us don't even remember a lot of these unconscious actions that we do throughout the day, walking through doors or picking something up or even like itching your face. Like, there are things that we do automatically without even realizing it. It reminds me of perhaps some of you have done this, where you're driving and then you get home and you don't remember how you got home because you were kind of just spacing out or listening to music or a podcast or just in your head about something. And it's terrifying to me that I'm able to do that, but it's the same kind of mental process. I commute a lot, and so my schema for driving and freeways, especially if it's a commute that I've done before, I can kind of just like not go on autopilot, but like I'm still driving and I'm assuming driving safely. It's not like I'm passed out. But there's this unconscious thing that's taking care of that activity for me. Kind of like, part of my brain is asleep and resting while the other is doing the work. It's very odd, and it kind of freaks me out that my brain is able to do things without me being aware of it necessarily. But that is what our brains do. And so going back to our image, I'll use myself as an example. When people see me, typically they see young, especially when I'm in a environment like a college where most professors are a little older. I think we have pretty good representation of younger ones that are at IVC, but still most people think I'm a student when I go anywhere, which can get annoying if I'm in a staff meeting and people say, "Oh, are you a student representative?" I'm like, "Nope." I'm very obviously white. My skin is literally translucent. I show as female and I identify as female, and because I wear certain clothes and have a certain appearance, I typically come off as middle class. And so that's what people see. Is that something that causes me a lot of grief? No. I'm very aware that I live in a society that actively benefits from being a lot of these things, most of these things, with the exception of sometimes young and female. So it's not the same as that Asian man who somebody can look at him and say, "Oh, you are the model minority, quote unquote. You play instruments and you are good at math." Like there's a lot more damage there than there is for the stereotypes that come from mine. But that person, if they don't know me, or if they don't know a lot of people, a lot of women, for example, they could sort of go to some of the basic stereotypes of, oh, women are really emotional, or, oh, she's younger and she's female, she must be looking to get married and wants a man. And, oh, she wants kids. And that's one that seems to irritate a lot of women my age who are in professions. I would say a couple times a year, somebody will say, "Well, what are you going to do with your career when you have kids?" And there's a lot of interesting stuff there. First of all, the when you have kids, assuming that I will naturally be doing that and it will happen. Whereas a lot of women either cannot have children or are choosing not to, which I'm in the latter, at least for now, because we value our careers. And also, I don't need that in my life. I have a cat. But there's also, what are you going to do with your career? Insinuating that having a child is going to interrupt my career and that I will need to choose the child, which is interesting because men don't get asked this at all. We live in a very gender biased society where careers are treated like a space for women to exist in, oftentimes until they have kids. And there's a lot of shame that's put on women who work and have a child, thinking, oh, you're taking time away from the child, where we don't think that of the man. There's still a lot of really negative stuff that comes from that for the men too. Like whenever people say, oh, that's so nice, daddy's babysitting. Well, that's really shitty. It's his kid. Like, insinuating that he's not capable of parenting. So I could go off on that for a while. Is this damaging? No. It's annoying, certainly. There's a lot of these assumptions that are much, much worse, especially when they have to do with race or gender identity or disability or religious preference, sexual preference, all of those things. It can end up being a lot more negative. And so 2 terms to think about are in-grouping and out-grouping. So we are in certain groups. I am in the group of female. I am in the group of white. I'm in the group of younger, although not as young as most of you. And so I have more of a variety, and I understand, like, oh, that person is female, but just because she's female, it doesn't mean that she really wants a kid right now. That's not an essential part of her being. Whereas if somebody's in the outgroup of somebody, they're not going to see necessarily those nuances. And so I have this experience a couple times. I have a lot of students, and perhaps you are one, who's into games, so like gamers, and I'm definitely in the outgroup there. And I admit that I've got some weird assumptions and stereotypes that come from my biases about gamers. I think there's a generally negative stereotype, which is starting to go away because of the popularity of esports and stuff like that. It's becoming more legitimized. But I've definitely made some comments in class, and I've had, I think 2 students have said, like, actually, that's not true about the gaming community. I was like, oh my gosh, that's true. I was just looking like outside through these foggy windows, and I couldn't really see the nuance that was actually there. And I thought that I had the whole picture, and I didn't. And so there's that picture of the old dude on there, because this brings up the importance of experiences as well. So there's the classic archetype of the World War II veteran, for example, or the Vietnam vet. People who have fought wars in other countries, a lot of times they're categorized as pretty racist. I think most white people, or people who have some white family, have like a racist elderly person in their family. I have plenty. And a lot of it comes from having these incredibly negative experiences in these countries. So one of my good friend's fathers will not go anywhere near like a pho restaurant or any Vietnamese restaurant, any Vietnamese food, which is so stupid. But like, yeah, he had a really bad experience in Vietnam. That was a real bummer for everybody, and it shouldn't have happened. And I don't doubt that those experiences were horrible. And human nature is to attach those experiences and look for something that's at fault. And so for him, it's not supporting any Vietnamese restaurants, which is quite a shame, because he's missing out on awesome food. But that shaped his schema, and he's sort of like closed the folder there, and allowed that to exist for him. And so there's something like that, explicit bias, where you can notice it. And so that racist father, I'm sorry, it is kind of racist. That's a whole other complicated area of when do we call somebody racist, which we can talk about at another date. My friend's dad is explicitly biased. He is stating, yeah, I won't go anywhere near that because all Vietnamese people are blank. I don't even know what his arguments have been. They're ridiculous. So if he ever sort of like had a come to Jesus moment, he could look at his actual actions and say, oh my gosh, yeah, I hold this bias. But we can see what his bias is. We're conscious of it. He's conscious of it. That leads us to implicit bias, which is way scarier because we have no idea that it's there. In the same way that I'm able to drive home without realizing how I got there, that means there's this invisible driver in me that is still able to maintain Professor Holbrook functions, even if Professor Holbrook is daydreaming about something completely different. But that means that other Taylor Holbrook in there, other Professor Holbrook in there, has opinions that may not be visible to me. And those opinions are very shaped by what we see and what we've absorbed a lot of times when we're younger. And sometimes these are formed, of course, there's positive, negative experiences, but mainly just by context. If we see a larger group deciding this is the way something is, we will learn that that's the way something is. So I put the Steve Irwin up there because I think about kids and how they learn what's scary and what's not. I don't have children, but a lot of my friends do, and I'm very fascinated just seeing how kids learn, because a lot of times it's not that they've experienced that thing directly. They've seen other people experiencing it, and so therefore they think that that experience is true for them too. So I have a good example of I have a tiny neighbor named Violet. She's wonderful. She really likes bugs. She has a bug collection. She has no problem having them crawl on her when she's in the garden. She has all these books about bugs. And she started watching a TV show where all of these little kids encountered spiders. And every time they saw a spider, they'd go, eek, and then they'd run away. Now, Violet always really liked spiders, and she had no problem with them. She never had an incident where she was bit. Granted, it's not like her mom is like putting her around all these black widows. That would be horrible parenting. But her mom noticed that from that moment on, whenever she saw a spider in a book, she would kind of deadpan say, eek, scary, and like cover her eyes, but you could tell she wasn't scared. She was just sort of mimicking what she saw other people doing. And just like that, her love of bugs sort of dissolved into I've been told this thing is scary, therefore it is scary. And so Violet didn't choose for that to happen. It just happened, which is a shame because I liked her little bug collection. Oh, why is it doing this? Oh, come on, man.